and questions started coming. And so we said, well, where are we going to go on this mystery retreat? And he said, well, that's part of the mystery. And we said, okay, what are we going to do on this mystery retreat? You know, are we going to do service projects? Are we going to do Bible study? What are we going to do? And he said, well, that's part of the mystery. And so we tried to get clever. We tried to discover. We wanted answers. And so we said, well, okay, well, what do we bring on this retreat? Do we bring shorts and flip-flops and beach towels? Or do we bring hiking boots and heavy clothes and walking sticks? What do we bring? And he said, that's part of the mystery. And we quickly learned that the only way we were going to find out where we were going and what we were doing was to go on the trip. And that's what we did. One Friday afternoon, we met in the church parking lot with all kinds of equipment, beach stuff and mountain stuff and all kinds of stuff in between, and we packed into the church vans and we took off. And a couple of hours later, we ended up at this church camp that we had never been to before. And I got to tell you, it was such a good mystery. To this day, I have no idea where we were. I don't even know the name of the camp, the retreat center. I couldn't get there if I wanted to. It was a mystery. And then we played these games where they didn't tell us the rules or what it was about. We just had to participate and kind of figure it out. And one time, the youth leader gathered us together and he said, we want you to make a circle. And some of our youth are going to like this. And he had a broomstick. And he got into the circle beside the other youth, and he took the broomstick and he pounded it on the floor, and he said, if you can't do this, then you can't do that. And he put it in his other hand, and he handed it to the teenager beside him and said, now you see if you can get it right. And he said, get what right? You see if you can get it right. See if you do it right. What? And finally the teenager said, if you can't do this, you can't do that. And he handed it to the next person, and the youth leader said, nope, you didn't get it. Okay? So the next person, no, you didn't get it. And sometimes he would say, yeah, you got it. And the person that got it didn't know what they got. And he never told us the secret. That simply, if after you're saying, if you can't do this, you can't do that, if you put it in your other hand and pass it along, then you got it. And he never told us. And around it went, and we had to pay attention. We had to focus on what was going on. We had to open our eyes, and we had to open our imaginations, and eventually we discovered what it was. And after going around and around the circle, eventually everyone discovered how to get it. And this is what we did on this retreat. And we did Bible studies where we were not told what to think or what it means, but we were invited into the text to discover. And we would do things together as a group, and we were discovering, and even though we weren't told what to do, we came together. And it was one of the most incredible, memorable retreats that I went on. And I don't even know where I went. But as a youth group, we grew closer together because we were discovering together. We grew closer to God, not because they were giving us answers, but because we were discovering come to a scripture passage and you read it and you realize that you have more questions than answers? Has that ever happened? Did you read the Transfiguration text this week? Because I got to be honest with you, every time I read that passage, I have more questions. And I'm not sure that it teaches or tells us specifically anything. I mean, it tells us, but it's not as if we learn from just the print. And sometimes what we find out, sometimes what we learn is that we go to the Bible not to be told, but to discover. Sometimes we go to the Scripture and we don't find answers, we just find better questions. And when I go to Transfiguration, there are a lot of questions. And if you look at it, it says 6 days later. Well, what happened in those 6 days? Why don't we get to find out what took place those 6 days? Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. He only took some of the disciples. Why? Why is it that all the disciples couldn't go up on the mountain? And if only some of them can go, why James and John and Peter? I imagine that these guys were asking some of the same questions. I wonder if they wondered what they were doing. Like in the children's sermon, if they thought they were going to pray, or if they thought they were going to get it and they were in trouble. Why are we going? Why isn't everyone else? And then this amazing thing happens. Jesus is transfigured and his clothes become dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. Just this amazing, unexplainable thing happens. And then Elijah and Moses show up. Why Elijah and Moses? Why not Abraham? Why not King David? Why not Jeremiah? Amos? Elijah and Moses? There's questions about this. And then you can tell the uncertainty from the disciples. Peter's not sure what to do, but he feels like he has to do something. And so he starts to make these booths. And he says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. Should we make these booths? And he didn't know what to say. And they were terrified. They were terrified and amazed and full of wonder all at the same time. And then a cloud comes and covers everything up. And God speaks. And then it's done. And they're walking down the mountain. And I have to imagine that as they're walking down the mountain, that they might have more questions. There's more questions, like what happened? What just happened? Was that really Elijah and Moses? And did you guys catch what they were saying? They were talking to each other. I didn't hear it. Did you hear it? Well, what were they talking about? Why did his clothes become so white? What took place? And then Jesus, the only thing that Jesus says is, hey, don't tell anybody what you just saw until I'm risen from the dead. Well, what does that mean? Risen from the dead? And there's all of these questions. And so they go on this mysterious trip. These amazing and wonderful and mysterious things take place. And they come down the mountain, perhaps with more questions. And when we read the text, when I read the text, I come out with more questions. I mean, what does this mean? What are we supposed to make of this? Well, why did this happen to Jesus, and why is it important to the story? And what's going on here? And, if I was up there and God was speaking, there would be a part of me that would want to say, hey, God, while you're speaking, I got a couple questions for you. And there's no real answers. there's more questions, but yet it's still amazing and wonderful. And I think that perhaps they weren't going to get answers up there. They weren't going to get answers until they continued on the journey and they would discover them. There's something special about this text. There's something special about this story. And yes, it raises a lot of questions and it makes us shake our head and it makes us wonder. But something happened there. And something happened with it. I have an interesting story about this story in my preaching life. There was a time when I was to preach this text. I think it was the first time that I was going to preach this text, and I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to tell anybody. I didn't know what to teach. There's a lot of information, but I wasn't sure. And that moment, transformed my preaching. And what happened was, I used to write a manuscript for my sermons. I used to write every single word. Write it all out. And I would study, I'd get into the text on Monday, and I'd read the commentaries, and I'd read other sermons on it, and I'd start doing all the studying and thinking and praying. And about Wednesday, I would start writing, and then by the end of the day on Thursday, I tried to have it written. I'd take Fridays off, and then Saturday evening, after I put the kids to bed, they were a lot younger then, I would break out my manuscript and I'd go over it and I'd practice preaching it. And I'd make corrections. I'd change things. But this week, on Saturday night, all I had was the beginning of the first sentence and it wasn't even complete. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to talk about, what to say about this text. And I sat there on a Saturday night and there with pen in hand trying to write something, to think of something to write. And after about 20 minutes, I put the pen down and I put my head down. And all I could think about was Peter and what that must have been like. And I got up from the kitchen table and I started pacing around the kitchen and I thought about Peter. And finally I went into the room where Kara was and I said, Kara, I can't come up with anything to write, but all I can think about is Peter. And maybe what I ought to do is just tell the story as if I'm Peter. And I started saying this and she asked some questions and she said, yeah, you ought to do that. And I went back into the kitchen, and instead of sitting down, I started walking around, and I worked out the monologue. And the next Sunday, I walked into the pulpit without a single word, without a single note. And I was a little terrified. And I got up to preach, and I took off my coat, and I rolled up my sleeves, and I just said, if you think it was easy climbing up that mountain that day, you're wrong. And I went in as if I was Peter. And the congregation just froze. And no one fell asleep. And it was like, wow. And I was surprised too. And I never went back to manuscript. This text that I could not explain, that I couldn't come up with any answers to, changed my preaching. And something amazing happened on that mountain that we can't fully describe and even understand. It does raise questions. But it calls us to pay attention. God does speak. The cloud comes and covers this mysterious presence of God comes, and God speaks. And He says something very simple, but yet so profound and important. God says, "This is my my Son, the beloved. Listen to him. Listen. Now this was an important word. Because even though they were following Jesus and they had given their lives up to follow Jesus, Jesus was trying to tell them something that they need to listen to. Just there in the 8th chapter, just the chapter before in Mark's Gospel, Jesus has told them, listen guys, the Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem and he has to be persecuted. And he's going to be falsely accused by the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're going to kill him. And 3 days later, he's going to rise again. He was telling them what is happening, and they couldn't make sense of it. Remember, Peter jumps in and says, wait a minute, we're not going to let that happen. And Jesus says, what? Get behind me, Satan. You're not listening, Peter. God shows up and he says, listen, there's something important being said by Jesus. And then right after this, in the 9th chapter, Jesus says it again. The Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to be handed over to the scribes and elders. They're going to kill him and he's going to rise again. He says it again in the 10th chapter. And by the 11th chapter, they're in Jerusalem. He's telling them, and they can't quite grasp it. They can't quite put their heads around it. Why is this man that we followed, this man that is God, that we've come to see as God, why is he going to die? Why is that happening? We can't make sense of it. And you see, when they were on the mountain, God could have tried to explain it all to them, but that's not what God did. Instead, God said, listen. And God invited them to discover. Jesus goes back and says, don't say anything until after the resurrection. Hold on to it. And part of that is because they couldn't put words to it. They couldn't make sense of it until it had happened, until they had gone on that journey, until they had received and understood the resurrected Christ, until they discovered. And once they discovered it for themselves, they took off into mission to share it with the world. And this is hard, this understanding of why Jesus must die and what we make of it at resurrection, especially before it had happened. But they're invited not to be told, but to discover it. They're called to just trust, just hang on, just stay on the journey and discover. Now, this text at this time is important for us because we are coming to an end to the season of Epiphany, to the light, to the aha of who Jesus is. And the light of Epiphany will fade into the ashes of Lent. Lent begins next week. Do you know that? Ash Wednesday, on Wednesday. And as we turn to Lent, as we take on the ashes, our gaze will turn to the cross. To the cross. To crucifixion. To suffering. To humiliation and pain. And then we will see past that to resurrection. And as we focus on that, we start to challenge what this means and how we understand it. And we have to be careful to try to oversimplify it or even to try to put words to it. Because the truth is, for 2,000 years, we've tried to put words to what this means. And sometimes we've kind of really mixed it all up. We've come up with these atonements that, yeah, I mean, there's atonement in it and all of this, but sometimes in our trying to put words and a complete understanding, what we end up doing is creating what N.T. Wright says is creating a sense that what this was really about is that God so hated the world that he killed his son. But the gospel says, for God so loved the world that he gave his son. And so it's not so much that we can put definite words to it, that we get definite answers to this, but we discover that in suffering, there is redemption. In death, there comes life. That in humiliation, Christ is glorified. And we can't give easy answers. But if we focus, we pay attention, we can discover. Discover the wonder, the awe, the amazing being of Christ, the incredibleness of God's powerful love. So listen.